Here is something the history books skip over. Around 9,600 years before the birth of Christ, something ended. Not a war, not a plague, not a slow decline that gave people time to adapt or flee or write down what was happening. Something ended the way a light goes out, suddenly, completely, without warning. The human population of the planet, which had been building slowly and painfully for hundreds of thousands of years, collapsed, not everywhere equally, but across vast stretches of the inhabited world. Entire populations simply disappeared. Communities that had been living in the same places for generations went silent. Tool traditions that had been developing and refining themselves for thousands of years stopped. Sites that show continuous habitation for millennia show nothing after a certain point. Just absence. Just the archaeological silence that tells you something catastrophic happened here, and nobody came back. Estimates vary. They always do when you're working with evidence this old and this sparse. But the most careful analyses of ancient DNA, of population genetics, of archaeological site density across multiple continents, suggest that the human population during and immediately after this period dropped by somewhere between 70 and 90%. Some researchers put it lower, some put it higher. Nobody puts it low enough to be reassuring. 90%. Think about what that means. Think about every 10 people you know. 9 of them gone, not sick, not displaced, gone. Entire family lines ending. Entire bodies of knowledge, languages, stories, techniques, songs, ways of understanding the world, vanishing with the people who carried them. The accumulated cultural inheritance of generations erased not by conquest, but by something that did not care whether you were young or old, skilled or unskilled, wise or ignorant, something that simply made the world uninhabitable for most of the people living in it. And here is the part that haunts me. We do not know exactly what it was. We have theories, strong ones, with real evidence behind them. Multiple theories, actually, each supported by different kinds of data, each explaining a different piece of what happened. And the most likely answer is that it was not one thing at all. It was several things, hitting simultaneously or in rapid sequence, each one compounding the damage of the others, each one making the survivors more vulnerable to the next blow. A cascade. A system failure at planetary scale. But we do not have a clean, simple, universally agreed upon answer, and that is part of what makes this story so extraordinary. We're talking about an event that may have killed 9 out of every 10 humans alive, an event that reset human civilization so completely that everything we think of as civilization, agriculture, cities, writing, organized religion, all of it emerged afterward from the small populations that survived, and we are still piecing together what happened. Tonight we are going to go into that darkness together. We are going to look at what the world was like before, at what the evidence tells us happened, at the different theories and what each of them can and cannot explain, at what it would have been like to live through it for the people who did not survive and for the people who barely did, and at what those survivors built afterward, in the fragile warmth of a world that had almost ended. Because the survivors did build something. The thing they built is perhaps the most mysterious structure on Earth, and it suggests that the people who came through the end of the world were not scattered, terrified remnants living hand to mouth. They were organized, they had a purpose, and they had something they needed to remember. We will get there. But first, let us go back. Back to before. Back to the world that was about to end. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what existed. And what existed in the millennia before 9600 BC was extraordinary. Not in the way we usually imagine prehistory. Not caves and isolation and brutal simplicity. Extraordinary in the way that complexity, which has had a long time to develop, is always extraordinary, even when it leaves few physical traces. The period we're talking about begins in the late Paleolithic and runs into the early Mesolithic. These labels are archaeological conveniences. They describe technology, primarily. The tools people made. But technology is only a fraction of what a culture is, and the cultures of this period were far richer than their tools suggest. Consider what we know about the people of this era from the physical evidence alone. They were anatomically identical to us, the same brain, the same vocal apparatus, the same capacity for language, for abstract thought, for symbolic representation. They had been fully modern humans in the biological sense for at least 200,000 years, and they had been behaviorally modern, meaning they had art, ritual, symbolic communication, complex social structures for at least 50,000 years before the event we are discussing. 50,000 years is an enormous amount of time. 50,000 years ago is so far before the pyramids that the pyramids might as well be yesterday by comparison. In 50,000 years, fully modern human minds had been working on the problems of survival, social organization, ecological knowledge, and cultural transmission. The result was not primitive people stumbling around in ignorance. The result was sophisticated, highly adapted populations with deep knowledge of their local environments and complex networks of social connection, extending far beyond their immediate communities. The Magdalenian culture of Western Europe is a good example. These are the people who painted the caves of Lascaux and Altamira, who carved the Venus figurines found across a vast geographic range from France to Siberia, who made instruments, who buried their dead with ochre and grave goods suggesting belief in something beyond death. They were trading obsidian and shells across hundreds of kilometers. They were tracking animal migrations with enough precision to be at the right location at the right time, reliably year after year. This is not improvisation. This is knowledge. Accumulated, tested, refined, and transmitted across generations through exactly the kind of cultural inheritance we discussed when we talked about human evolution. The Magdalenian people did not discover where the reindeer migrated each autumn. They knew. The knowledge had been built up over generations and passed down through the teaching that the long human childhood makes possible. Every successful hunt was the product of inherited understanding layered on top of personal experience, layered on top of careful observation. And they were not alone in this sophistication. Across the globe, in Africa, in the Middle East, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, in the Americas, which had been populated by humans for at least 20,000 years by this point, complex cultures had developed their own bodies of knowledge, their own social structures, their own ways of understanding and managing their relationships with their environments. The details differed enormously. The underlying sophistication was consistent. Now think about the population numbers. This is important for understanding the scale of what was lost. Estimates of global human population in the millennia before the event vary, but most fall in the range of 5 million to 15 million people. That sounds small by modern standards. The city of Tokyo has more people than that. But for a species without agriculture, without the ability to produce and store food at scale, dependent on the productivity of wild ecosystems that varied enormously from place to place and season to season, 5 to 15 million people was the carrying capacity of the planet. Every one of those people represented a successful adaptation to a specific environment. Every community represented accumulated generations of ecological knowledge, and that knowledge was not written down. It existed in people, in their memories, their skills, their cultural practices, their stories, their relationships with each other and with the landscape they inhabited. When the people died, the knowledge died with them, and in some regions the people died in such numbers and so quickly that the chain of transmission was broken completely. The knowledge was simply gone, irretrievably. No record, no recovery. That is what was at stake. Not just lives, as devastating as the loss of lives is. The entire accumulated ecological knowledge of human populations that have been developing their understanding for thousands of years, wiped out in a geological instant. Let's talk about the world those people lived in. Whereas the world of 12,000 years ago was not the world we know, and that difference matters enormously for understanding what happened. The last ice age, which scientists call the last glacial maximum, had peaked around 26,000 years ago. At its peak, ice sheets covered enormous portions of the northern hemisphere. The Laurentide ice sheet covered essentially all of Canada and much of the northern United States under ice that in places was 3 to 4 kilometers thick. The Scandinavian ice sheet covered northern Europe. Sea levels were approximately 120 meters lower than today, because so much of the world's water was locked up in ice. The world map looked completely different. Britain was connected to continental Europe by a broad land bridge called Doggerland. Southeast Asia was a much larger landmass. The Bering Land Bridge connecting Asia to the Americas was a broad, habitable plain. By the period we are discussing, the Deep Ice Age was over. The planet had been warming for roughly 15,000 years. The ice sheets had been retreating. Sea levels had been rising. The great megafauna, the mammoths and mastodons and woolly rhinos and giant ground sloths and cave bears, were under enormous pressure, both from the changing climate and from human hunters who had followed them across the continents. But the warming was not steady or smooth. It was lurching and uneven. The climate system was unstable, swinging between warmer and colder periods as the ice sheets melted and reorganized global ocean circulation patterns. The people living through this period were managing in a world of considerable climate variability. They were adapted to it, not comfortable necessarily, but capable. Their ecological knowledge included knowledge of how the landscape changed and how to respond. And then, approximately 12,900 years ago, something changed the entire picture. The climate lurched again, but this time it did not lurch toward warmth. It lurched violently back toward cold. Temperatures in the northern hemisphere dropped by as much as 15 degrees Celsius within a decade. In some regions, the evidence suggests the drop happened even faster. There are data points suggesting temperature changes of several degrees within individual years. The grasslands that had been expanding as the climate warmed began to retreat. The forest that had been recovering began to die back. The rivers changed their courses. The lakes changed their levels. The entire ecological landscape that human populations had been adapting to for thousands of years reorganized itself in ways that no generation of living humans had ever seen. This cold period is called the Younger Dryas. It lasted approximately 1,200 years. 1,200 years of conditions so cold, so dry, and so ecologically disrupted that vast areas of the previously inhabited world became uninhabitable. not everywhere, not all at once, but across enough of the planet, and severely enough, that the populations living there faced a choice between adaptation, migration, or death. And for most of them, the choices were worse than that framing implies. This is where the story gets complicated, and this is where the different theories come in. Because the Younger Dryas itself, as severe as it was, does not fully explain the scale of the human population collapse. Climate deterioration kills people. It displaces populations, it stresses ecosystems and breaks food chains, but it does it slowly enough, in most cases, that some adaptation is possible, some migration, some adjustment of subsistence strategies. What the evidence suggests happened around 12,900 years ago, and what the evidence also suggests ended with catastrophic abruptness around 11,700 years ago, is something that goes beyond ordinary climate deterioration, something that made the Younger Dryas not just a bad climate period, but a cascade of interlocking disasters that each made the others worse. To understand that cascade, we need to talk about ice. There is a river of cold water at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. It has been flowing there for millions of years. You cannot see it from the surface. You cannot feel it when you swim in the Atlantic. But it is there, moving slowly and relentlessly southward along the ocean floor, and the entire climate of the North Atlantic region depends on it being exactly where it is, and moving exactly as it moves. The system it is part of is called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. Scientists call it the AMOC. You may have heard it called the Ocean Conveyor Belt. The popular name is a reasonable simplification of something genuinely complex. Here is how it works. The Gulf Stream carries warm, salty tropical water northward along the surface of the Atlantic. This warm water releases its heat into the atmosphere as it travels north, warming Western Europe to temperatures far higher than its latitude would otherwise suggest. London is at roughly the same latitude as Calgary, Canada, but London's climate is mild and rainy, while Calgary's winters are brutal. The difference is the heat the Gulf Stream releases into the atmosphere over the North Atlantic. As the Gulf Stream water releases its heat and reaches the far north, it cools, and because it is salty, and cold salty water is denser than warm fresh water, it sinks. It descends to the ocean floor and flows southward along the bottom of the Atlantic. This creates a circulation loop. Warm water at the surface flowing north, cold water at the bottom flowing south. The loop drives enormous amounts of heat transfer from the tropics to the northern latitudes. Without it, the climate of the entire North Atlantic basin would be dramatically colder. Now here is the vulnerability. The sinking that drives the circulation happens because the northern Atlantic water is dense. It is dense because it is cold and salty. If you make it less salty, or if you warm it significantly, it becomes less dense. It does not sink as efficiently. The circulation weakens. And if the circulation weakens enough, it can reach a tipping point and shut down. Not forever, but for centuries to millennia. And when it shuts down, the North Atlantic region cools dramatically, because the heat transfer from the tropics has been interrupted. This shutdown is not theoretical. It has happened before, multiple times during the deglaciation. The evidence for past shutdowns is preserved in ocean sediments and in ice cores from Greenland. And the most dramatic shutdown, the one associated with the beginning of the Younger Dryas, appears to have been triggered by exactly the kind of event you would predict. An enormous pulse of fresh water into the North Atlantic from a melting ice sheet. As the Laurentide ice sheet retreated during the warming period before the Younger Dryas, it created enormous glacial lakes along its southern margin. These lakes were held in place by ice dams, walls of ice that formed natural barriers containing millions of cubic kilometers of fresh meltwater. When those ice dams failed, the water they had been containing did not drain gradually. It drained catastrophically. Lake Agassiz is the one scientists focus on most often. It was one of the largest lakes in the history of the planet, covering an area larger than all of today's Great Lakes combined. When its eastern ice dam failed, the meltwater it released flowed into the St. Lawrence River and from there into the North Atlantic. The volume of water was staggering. The release was rapid. And the effect on the Atlantic's salt concentration, and therefore on the circulation, was exactly what you would predict from the physics. The circulation slowed, possibly shut down completely or nearly so. The heat transfer from the tropics to the North Atlantic region stopped, and the temperature dropped. This is the standard scientifically accepted explanation for the onset of the Younger Dryas. It is robust. It is supported by multiple independent lines of evidence. It makes physical sense. And it explains the European and North Atlantic evidence reasonably well. But here is the thing. It does not explain everything. It does not explain the global reach of the climate disruption, which extended far beyond the North Atlantic region. It does not explain some of the evidence from the onset of the Younger Dryas that suggests an initial trigger even more rapid and energetic than a glacial lake outburst flood would produce. And it does not explain a specific layer of evidence found across multiple continents that has generated one of the most heated debates in all of paleoclimatology. The layer is called the Younger Dryas boundary layer. It appears in sediment cores and archaeological sites across a huge geographic range, from North America to Europe to the Middle East to parts of Asia. It contains a specific set of markers that are unusual and that cluster at the same moment in time. Microscopic diamonds called nanodiamonds, which form under conditions of extreme pressure and heat. Magnetic spherules, tiny spherical particles that form when rock is melted and rapidly cooled. Iridium, a metal rare on Earth's surface but common in extraterrestrial objects. Soot, in quantities consistent with massive wildfires. Platinum, shocked quartz. This is the signature of an impact event, or something very much like an impact event. The hypothesis, first proposed in a major scientific paper in 2007 and subsequently expanded and debated extensively, is that around 12,900 years ago, the Earth encountered a fragmented comet or asteroid, not a single impactor. A swarm of fragments distributed across a wide arc of the sky, striking the planet at multiple locations over a short period of time. The impacts would have been centered on the ice sheets of the Northern Hemisphere, which is why the direct impact craters are hard to find. Ice does not preserve craters the way rock does. The impacts would have released enormous amounts of energy, triggering immediate wildfires across large areas, sending debris into the atmosphere and possibly triggering the glacial lake outburst flood that disrupted the ocean circulation. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is controversial. That is not a diplomatic understatement. It is genuinely contested science, with serious researchers on both sides presenting real evidence and real arguments. The evidence for the impact markers is real and has been replicated by independent research groups. The interpretation of that evidence as requiring an extraterrestrial impact is disputed. Some researchers argue the markers can be explained by other processes. The debate is ongoing. What is not disputed is this: something happened at the onset of the Younger Dryas that was rapid, energetic, and globally significant. Whether that something was purely a glacial lake flood disrupting ocean circulation, or whether it involved an extraterrestrial impact or airburst, or some combination of the two, the result was the same. The climate changed faster than almost any previous climate transition in the geological record. And the world that human populations had been living in for thousands of years ended in what was, by geological standards, an instant. Now let's talk about what that felt like. If you are using this to fall asleep tonight, that is exactly what these videos are for. Maybe subscribe and leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I always read the comments. It is one of my favourite things about making these. And then let's keep going, because the story is far from over. Picture the world in the days before it changed, not the moment before, because no one alive at the time knew a moment before from any other moment. They just knew their world, their landscape, the rhythm of it. If you are living in what will one day be called the British Isles, you are not on an island. You are on a peninsula extending from the northwestern edge of a continuous landmass. To your south and east, across the broad green plain of Doggerland, lies the rest of Europe. Doggerland is not a wasteland. It is rich habitat. Wetlands and rivers and forests and grasslands, teeming with the animals that human hunters has been managing and following for centuries. Some of the densest human populations in the region live there, on the flat, resource-rich ground between the rivers. If you are in the Middle East, in the region that will one day be called the Fertile Crescent, you're living in a landscape considerably more hospitable than the desert that occupies the same geography today. The climate of the late Pleistocene, while variable, has maintained enough moisture in this region to support open woodland and grassland. Wild grains grow here. Gazelles and aurochs graze the hillsides. The rivers run reliably. The people who live here are beginning to do something new. They're beginning to manage their relationship with wild plants and animals in ways that go slightly beyond pure hunting and gathering, not agriculture yet, not domestication, but something proto-agricultural, an intensification of the relationship with specific plants and specific animal populations that will, after the catastrophe, eventually become farming. If you are in North America, you are living in a world still full of megafauna. Mammoths still walk the grasslands of the continent's interior, though their numbers have been declining for millennia under pressure from human hunters and the slowly changing climate. Giant ground sloths the size of modern elephants browse the forests of the south. Horses, which will go extinct on this continent and not return until the Spanish bring them back thousands of years later, graze the plains. American camels, short-faced bears, dire wolves. The Pleistocene megafauna of North America is still intact, barely on the eve of the Younger Dryas. It will not survive what is coming. Across all these regions, human populations are connected to each other and to their environments in ways that have been built and maintained over many generations. Trade routes carry obsidian from volcanic sources hundreds of kilometers to communities that need its sharp edges for cutting tools. Shell ornaments from coastal populations appear at inland sites. The networks are invisible in the archaeological record except for the objects that move along them, but the objects tell us the networks were real and extensive. Now let us think about the speed of what happened next. Because the speed is one of the most important and most disturbing facts about the Younger Dryas onset. Paleoclimatologists have extracted ice cores from the Greenland ice sheet that preserve a year-by-year record of the climate stretching back more than 100,000 years. Each year of snowfall becomes a layer of ice. The chemistry of that ice, the ratios of different oxygen isotopes, the amounts of dust and pollen and other atmospheric particles trapped in it, tells scientists what the climate was like in the year that snow fell. When scientists read the Greenland ice cores across the transition into the Younger Dryas, what they find is terrifying. The transition is not gradual. It is not even rapid by the normal standards of climate change. It is almost instantaneous. Within a period of perhaps 1 to 3 years, the chemistry of the ice changes completely. The dust levels spike, the temperature proxies plunge, the atmospheric circulation shifts. 1 to 3 years, that is within a single human lifetime, within the memory of a living person who experienced normal conditions and then watched everything change. Think about what that means for the people who lived through it. In 1 year, the weather is unusual. Cold for longer than expected in the spring, the seasonal migrants arriving late, the wild grains producing poorly, strange storms, nothing that seems catastrophic yet, just anomalous. In the second year, it is worse. The cold that came early last autumn is still here. The rivers are running lower. The grasslands that supported the animals everyone depends on are looking different. Patchier. Some of the familiar grazing areas have not recovered from the winter. The older people have never seen anything like this. The stories they carry of past bad years do not cover what they are seeing. By the third year, for populations in the worst affected areas, the situation is becoming desperate. The food sources that the community has relied on for generations are failing. The ecological knowledge that made survival possible is becoming obsolete, because the ecosystem it described no longer exists in the same form. The animals are moving. Some of them are dying in place, unable to adapt to the rapid change faster than evolution can operate. The plants are changing. The rivers are running at the wrong times of year, and the community is using up its stored resources and its social capital, trying to manage a crisis that shows no sign of ending. Now compound that across a decade, 2 decades, a generation. The Younger Dryas lasted 1,200 years. No one alive when it began was alive when it ended. The people born into the worst of it knew nothing else. They did not know what had been lost because they had never experienced what existed before. They were managing in a world that their ancestors' accumulated knowledge did not prepare them for, because their ancestors' accumulated knowledge had been built for a different world. This is what makes the Younger Dryas so devastating from a human perspective. It is not just the raw physical difficulty of surviving in a colder, drier, more volatile climate. It is the obsolescence of inherited knowledge, the disconnection between what people knew, accumulated across generations of successful adaptation, and what the world now required of them. When the ecological relationships that form the basis of your subsistence strategy collapse, your options are limited. You can move, you can change what you eat, you can cooperate more intensively with other groups, pooling resources and risk across a wider network, or you can die. In the worst affected areas, most people died. The die-off was not uniform. It was geographically patchy, reflecting the uneven distribution of the climate impacts and the uneven prior distribution of human populations. Some regions were hit harder than others. Some communities had geographical advantages that others lacked. Proximity to coastlines, which moderated temperature extremes and provided alternative food sources. Proximity to refugia, areas where the ecological productivity held up better than the surrounding landscape. Access to trade networks that could buffer local food failures with external resources. But the overall trajectory across the affected regions was toward catastrophic population reduction. The genetic evidence is clear on this. When scientists look at the population history of modern humans using genetic diversity as a proxy, they see a dramatic bottleneck in the lineages that survived this period. A reduction in genetic diversity, consistent with a severe reduction in population size. The signature of an event in which many, many lines of descent simply ended. Now let us talk about some of the specific things that went wrong, because the climate was not the only problem. The climate was the trigger that activated a cascade of secondary disasters, each one making the overall situation worse. The first secondary disaster was the extinction of the megafauna. This had been building for a long time before the Younger Dryas. The large mammals of the Pleistocene, the mammoths, the mastodons, the giant ground sloths, the woolly rhinos, the Irish elk, the cave lions, had been under pressure from human hunters for millennia. Humans are extraordinarily effective hunters of large, slow-reproducing animals. The combination of cooperative hunting strategies, long-range projectile weapons, fire, and the ability to drive entire herds over cliffs or into natural traps made humans capable of killing large animals faster than those animals could reproduce. Populations that had no evolutionary experience with human hunters were especially vulnerable. The result was that by the onset of the Younger Dryas, many megafauna populations were already reduced, not extinct, but stressed, depleted. Operating with smaller population sizes and reduced genetic diversity that made them more vulnerable to additional shocks. The Younger Dryas delivered those shocks. The rapid climate change altered the habitats that megafauna depended on. The vegetation communities that mammoths and mastodons ate changed dramatically. The cold, dry conditions of the Younger Dryas expanded certain plant communities and contracted others in ways that were often unfavourable for large herbivores. Animals that might have survived either the hunting pressure or the climate change alone could not survive both simultaneously. The extinctions came rapidly by geological standards. In North America, most of the megafauna were gone within 1,000 years of the Younger Dryas onset. The mammoths, the mastodons, the giant sloths, the horses, the camels, an entire guild of large herbivores that had been part of the American ecosystem for millions of years, gone within a millennium. The predators that depended on them followed. The dire wolves, the short-faced bears, the American lion. For the human populations of North America, this was catastrophic in ways that go beyond the obvious. The megafauna were not just food. They were the anchor of entire subsistence systems. The ecological knowledge, the hunting techniques, the seasonal movements, the tool technologies optimized for hunting specific animals, all of this was built around the megafauna. When the megafauna disappeared, the entire subsistence system they supported became useless. People who had been highly successful hunters of mammoths were suddenly in a world with no mammoths. The skills that had made their ancestors successful were now irrelevant. The human populations had to rebuild their subsistence strategies from scratch, or near scratch, in the middle of a climate catastrophe that was making everything harder. Some of them managed. The evidence shows that human populations persisted in North America through the Younger Dryas. though in reduced numbers and with dramatically changed cultural expressions. The elaborate Clovis tool tradition, which had been extraordinarily successful and which had spread across the continent with remarkable speed, disappeared abruptly from the archaeological record right at the Younger Dryas boundary. What replaced it were smaller, more localized, more varied cultural expressions. The signature of populations that had lost the broad social networks and cultural coherence of their predecessors and were managing in isolation, adapting locally to local conditions rather than participating in continent-wide cultural conversations. The second secondary disaster was the flooding. As the Younger Dryas eventually ended, as the climate shifted back toward warmth around 11,700 years ago, the ice that had been preserved and even added to during the cold period began to melt again. And the melt was rapid, spectacularly rapid. The transition out of the Younger Dryas is, if anything, even more abrupt than the transition into it. The Greenland ice cores show a temperature increase of around 10 degrees Celsius within a decade. Some researchers argue the most dramatic changes happened even faster than that. All that melting ice went somewhere. It went into the oceans. Sea levels, which had been rising slowly during the post-glacial period, rose dramatically. The estimate for the rate of sea level rise during the most rapid phases of the melt is around 4 to 5 meters per century. 4 to 5 meters per century means roughly 4 to 5 centimeters per year. That does not sound fast, but over a century it transforms coastlines. Over a millennium it drowns landscapes. Doggerland disappeared beneath the North Sea. The process took centuries, but it was happening within the span of cultural memory. People living in coastal areas of Doggerland could have watched the sea advance during their lifetimes, their children's lifetimes, their grandchildren's lifetimes. The rich, densely populated wetlands and river plains of Doggerland, home to some of the largest human populations in northwestern Europe, were inundated. Some of the people moved inland. Many of them, or their descendants, did not have time. The flooding of the Black Sea is another piece of this story, and one that is particularly relevant to the flood myths that appear in virtually every culture that survived into the historical record. The Black Sea today is a large saltwater body connected to the Mediterranean through the Bosphorus Strait. But during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene it was not connected. It was a freshwater lake, isolated from the Mediterranean, with its surface level significantly lower than the Mediterranean sea level. Around 8,000 years ago, as sea levels continued to rise, the Mediterranean began to overtop the ridge that separated it from the Black Sea basin. The water that poured through that gap into the Black Sea basin was not a trickle. It was an enormous flood. The cascade of seawater into the freshwater lake would have raised the lake's level dramatically, rapidly, inundating coastal settlements and driving the people who lived there to flee inland. Was this the flood? Was this the event that generated the Mesopotamian flood myths, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and ultimately the biblical account of Noah? Some researchers think so. Others are skeptical. The flooding of the Black Sea, while real and well documented geologically, happened after the worst of the Younger Dryas event. It was a consequence of the melt, not the event itself. And the flood myths are so widespread across so many cultures that a single regional event seems insufficient to explain them all. More likely, the flood myths reflect a composite memory of many different flooding events across many different regions over many thousands of years, all encoding the same fundamental experience. The sea came, and the world we knew drowned. because that experience was not rare. It was not limited to the Black Sea. It happened repeatedly, in different forms, in different places, as the ice melted and the sea rose and landscapes that humans had lived on for generations were swallowed by water. The coasts of every continent changed dramatically during this period. The continental shelves that had been exposed during the glacial maximum, the land bridges and coastal plains that had supported human populations for tens of thousands of years, were drowned. And everywhere they were drowned, the people who had lived there were displaced or died. Think about the specific geography of this. The continental shelves are the shallow water areas around the edges of the continents. During the glacial maximum, with sea levels 120 metres lower than today, vast areas of these shelves were dry land. Many of them were rich, productive environments. River deltas, coastal wetlands, sheltered bays, the kinds of environments that human populations tend to cluster in. All of it was at or near sea level when the melt began. All of it was drowned as the sea rose. We will never excavate those sites. They are under tens to hundreds of meters of water. The human history that happened there, the communities that lived and died on those coastal landscapes over tens of thousands of years, is archaeologically inaccessible. We know those populations existed because their descendants left genetic signatures that show coastal migration routes. But the physical record of their lives is gone. This is one of the reasons the scale of the human population collapse during this period is so hard to document. The most densely populated regions, the coast-hugging populations that followed productive coastal environments around the world, left the least surviving archaeological record. Their sites are underwater. What we can see is only the inland populations, which represent a fraction of the total human presence. The third secondary disaster was famine. When you combine rapid climate deterioration, megafauna extinction, and the flooding of coastal habitats, what you get is a dramatic reduction in the productivity of every food system that human populations depended on. The cold, dry conditions of the Younger Dryas reduced plant productivity across enormous areas. The megafauna that had been a major caloric source for many populations were gone or dying. The coastal resources that coastal populations depended on were being disrupted by the rapid sea level changes, and the wild grain resources that people in places like the Middle East had been developing an intensified relationship with were stressed by the same cold, dry conditions. Famine is not a dramatic event. It does not announce itself. It arrives gradually, through the accumulation of smaller failures, the hunt that comes back empty, the grain patch that yields less than last year, the river fish that run late or not at all. Each individual failure is survivable. The community has reserves. It has social relationships that allow borrowing and sharing. It has stored knowledge about alternative resources. But when the failures accumulate, when every system is failing simultaneously rather than taking turns, the buffers run out, and then people die. The children go first. Their caloric reserves are smaller. Their immune systems are more vulnerable to the opportunistic infections that follow malnutrition. The elderly follow, and then the young adults who have been sharing their own calorie allotment with the children and elderly, weakening themselves in the process. The people who survive are not necessarily the strongest or the most skilled. They are the luckiest, the ones whose territory happen to still have productive food sources, the ones whose trade networks happen to connect them to regions less badly hit, the ones who made a decision at exactly the right moment to move in exactly the right direction. Luck is not a comfortable explanation for survival. We want there to be something more, some skill, some foresight, some quality of character that the survivors had and the victims lacked. But the scale and rapidity of the Younger Dryas catastrophe was such that it overwhelmed the adaptive capacity of most human populations in the affected regions regardless of their skills or their knowledge or their social organisation. The survivors were largely survivors of circumstance, and from those survivors the entire modern human population descends. Let's take a moment to think about what this felt like from the inside, not as a demographic statistic, not as an archaeological abstraction, as a human experience. You are a woman, 32 years old, which makes you among the elders of your community by the standards of this time. You have 3 children, 2 of whom have survived their first 5 years. You know things as took your parents and grandparents lifetimes to learn. You know which roots are edible and which are toxic. You know how to read the sky for weather. You know the names and habits of every animal in your territory. You know the stories that explain why the world is the way it is and what your obligations to it are. You are, by any meaningful measure, a knowledgeable and capable adult human being. The first bad year, you manage. Your community has been through hard years before, not as hard as this, but hard. You share more broadly than usual. You make decisions about which resources to use and which to save. You send scouts to regions you know are sometimes productive when your local territory is not. You get through it. The second year is harder. Your youngest child is thin in a way that frightens you. Your partner is losing weight faster than can be explained by the reduced rations everyone is on. The scouts who went to the neighbouring territory have not come back, and you're not sure if that means they found something and stayed, or if something went wrong. The decision to go and find out, or to stay and protect what you have, is the kind of decision that keeps you awake at night. By the third year, there are fewer of you. The elderly man who knew the best fishing spots on the river died in the winter. He was the only one who knew exactly where those spots were, and exactly what seasonal signs indicated when the fish would run. That knowledge is gone. 2 families from the eastern part of your territory have not been seen in months. You do not know if they moved on or died. Your youngest child is sick in a way that does not get better. You're down to resources you would never have touched in a good year. You're eating things that technically sustain life but do not make you well. Your body is doing things it was not designed to do, running on inputs it was not designed to run on. You are surviving. Barely. And the people around you, the people who have been your community for your entire life, are reduced to a fraction of what they were. The social fabric that made everything possible, the shared knowledge, the division of labour, the mutual support is fraying as the people who maintained it die or move on. The community that exists now is not the same community that existed 3 years ago. It has the same name maybe, but it does not have the same knowledge, the same capabilities, the same social relationships. It is a remnant, operating on the edge of what is survivable, and you still do not know when it will end. You have no way of knowing that it will last 1,200 years. You cannot imagine 1,200 years. You can barely imagine 12. What you know is that it has been this bad for longer than you have ever seen, and there is no sign of it getting better, and the people who would have known what to do, who would have had the wisdom and the knowledge and the social authority to organise a response, are gone. This is the human reality of the Younger Dryas, not a climate statistic. A woman lying awake in the dark with a sick child, trying to figure out how her community survives another year in a world that has stopped making sense. And across the planet, in hundreds of communities, in dozens of different languages, in ecosystems as different as the European tundra and the Levantine woodland and the American grassland and the Australian coast, versions of this woman are lying awake with the same questions. Most of them will not find answers. Most of them will become part of the demographic statistics, the 90% who did not make it. But some of them will find a way. And what those survivors did next is one of the most extraordinary and mysterious stories in all of human history. In 1994, a Kurdish shepherd was walking across a barren hilltop in southeastern Turkey, in the region that was once called Upper Mesopotamia, not far from the modern city of Sanliurfa. The hilltop was called Göbekli Tepe. In Turkish, the name means potbelly hill. It was an unremarkable-looking mound in an unremarkable landscape. The kind of hill that looks like it might be natural but has the slightly wrong geometry of something that has been disturbed or built. The shepherd noticed something sticking out of the soil. He went to look. What he found sticking out of the hill was the top of a large carved stone. He reported his find, and the hill was investigated by a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt, who spent the next 20 years excavating it before his death in 2014. What Schmidt found under that potbelly hill changed everything we thought we knew about the timeline of human civilization. Göbekli Tepe is a temple complex, the oldest known temple complex in the world by several thousand years. Its oldest layers, which have only been partially excavated, have been radiocarbon dated to approximately 11,500 years ago. Some researchers believe the earliest construction may be even older, pushing back into the period of the Younger Dryas itself. The most recent and scientifically well-documented layers date to right around 9,600 BC, the exact moment our story is focused on. At this site, more than 11,000 years ago, people who had no agriculture, no domesticated animals, no pottery, no written language, no metal tools, built enormous stone structures. The pillars that form the central features of the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe are T-shaped limestone columns, some of them standing 5 to 6 meters tall and weighing between 10 and 20 tons. They were quarried from the local limestone bedrock, shaped with stone tools, transported to the site, and erected in precise arrangements. And they're not plain. They're covered in elaborate carvings. Animals rendered with extraordinary skill and realism. Foxes, vultures, cranes, aurochs, lions, scorpions, spiders, abstract symbols whose meaning we do not understand. And on some of the T-shaped pillars, arms carved in relief, hands carved at the ends of those arms. The pillars are not just columns, they are stylized human figures. This is not supposed to exist. The standard model of human cultural development, the one that was taught in universities and written in textbooks for most of the 20th century, said that complex monumental architecture requires agriculture. You need surplus food to feed the workers. You need sedentary communities to organize the labor. You need the social complexity that only develops after people have been living in one place long enough to develop hierarchies, institutions, and the capacity for large-scale coordinated projects. And agriculture, sedentism, and social complexity all develop together, gradually, as part of the same process. Göbekli Tepe breaks this model completely. The people who built it were hunter-gatherers. The faunal remains at the site, the bones left behind from meals, show wild animals exclusively. No domesticated species. These people were not farmers. They did not have grain stores or permanent villages in the way the standard model requires. They were mobile, following seasonal resources, living in ways that should not, according to the standard model, have produced anything like what they built at Göbekli Tepe. And yet, they built it. With stone tools, without draft animals, without wheels or ropes or any of the technology that later monuments like Stonehenge or the Egyptian pyramids made use of. They moved 10 to 20-ton stones and erected them in circles with the geometric precision that would challenge a modern construction crew. The question of why is more important and more unresolved than the question of how. Schmidt's interpretation was religious. Göbekli Tepe was a sanctuary, a gathering place for dispersed hunter-gatherer groups who came together for ritual purposes. The animal carvings represented the spirit world, or the animals that defined the landscape, or the prey that human hunters depended on. or all of these things simultaneously. The site was a place where the boundaries between the human world and whatever lay beyond it were thinner, where the rituals that maintain the cosmic order could be performed, where the community of people who shared a world could affirm their shared identity. Other researchers have suggested different interpretations. Some have proposed that Göbekli Tepe was connected to ancestor veneration, to the dead who needed to be remembered and appeased. Some have proposed it was an observatory, a place for tracking astronomical phenomena that were important for organizing the community's seasonal movements. Some have argued that the scale of the project, the amount of labor it required, was itself the point. Building something this enormous required gathering people from a wide area, which facilitated social bonding, trade, marriage alliances, the exchange of information. The construction was the social event. None of these interpretations are mutually exclusive. A site can be all of these things at once. But there is one interpretation that sits underneath all the others, one context that makes the existence of Göbekli Tepe not just impressive but urgently important. Göbekli Tepe was built immediately after the end of the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas ended abruptly as it had begun. Around 11,700 years ago, the climate shifted again. The temperature rose, the monsoon strengthened, the grasslands began to recover, the rivers ran fuller, the plant productivity that had been suppressed for 1,200 years began to return. The world warmed, and the survivors of the worst period in human history for at least 10,000 years found themselves in a rapidly improving landscape. And the first thing they did, or among the first things, was build Göbekli Tepe. Why? Why, at the moment when the immediate survival crisis was lifting, would people invest the enormous social and physical energy required to build something like this? Why not focus on rebuilding population, on re-establishing food supplies, on recovering the social networks that the catastrophe had disrupted? The answer, I think, is memory. And the answer to why they focused on memory is also the answer to what Göbekli Tepe ultimately is. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were the survivors, or more precisely, they were the children and grandchildren of the survivors. They carried, in their living memory and in their cultural transmission, the stories of what had happened. They knew, because their parents and grandparents had told them, that the world they were living in was a world rebuilt from near nothing, that most of the people who had existed before were gone, that the knowledge that had sustained those populations had been largely lost, that the world had very nearly ended. And I think Göbekli Tepe was a response to that knowledge, a response to the terrifying understanding that the world could end, that the things you knew, the things your community knew, could be lost, that the only defense against that loss was to build something that could not be lost, something made of stone which lasts when people do not, something so large and so demanding that the people who built it would be remembered even if everything else about them was forgotten. Schmidt noted something significant about the way the site was eventually abandoned. Around 9,000 years ago, the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe were deliberately filled in, intentionally buried. The site was not abandoned because it was no longer useful. It was ritually interred, the way you bury something you want to preserve and protect. The builders of Göbekli Tepe, or their descendants, covered their greatest achievement in stone and rubble and left it for the future. They buried the memory in the earth where it could wait. It waited 11,000 years until a shepherd and an archaeologist found it. The world that emerged from the Younger Dryas was not the world that had gone into it. It was smaller. Its human population had been reduced to a fraction of what it had been. Its cultural complexity had collapsed and then begun rebuilding from simpler foundations. Its megafauna were largely gone, eliminating entire categories of prey that hunter-gatherer economies had depended on. But the world that emerged from the Younger Dryas was also, in important ways, more fertile than the world that had preceded it. The warming climate and increased rainfall of the early Holocene produced what some scientists call the Holocene climatic optimum. Not optimal for all purposes or all species, but optimal in the sense of warm and wet and biologically productive. The vegetation communities expanded, the rivers ran reliably. The wild grain populations that would eventually become domesticated wheat and barley grew in dense, productive stands across the hillsides of the Fertile Crescent, and the human populations that had survived the Younger Dryas, small and scattered as they were, began to respond to this productivity in ways that would permanently change the relationship between humans and the natural world. The shift toward agriculture was not sudden. It was not a discovery or an invention in the conventional sense. It was an intensification of practices that had been developing for thousands of years before the Younger Dryas, accelerated and redirected by the catastrophe. The proto-agricultural intensification that communities in the Fertile Crescent had been experimenting with before the cold period had been disrupted. But the knowledge had not been entirely lost. And in the warmer, more productive world of the early Holocene, that knowledge was rediscovered, refined, and pushed further. The earliest evidence of deliberate cultivation, of humans actively planting and tending wild grains, rather than just harvesting them where they found them, dates to around 11,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, right after the Younger Dryas. Within a few generations of the survivors looking at a warmer, more productive world and deciding to invest in it in ways their ancestors had not. Why did agriculture develop at this specific moment and not earlier? The conditions for proto-agriculture had existed in the Fertile Crescent before the Younger Dryas. Wild grains were there. The human intelligence and social organization required for agriculture was there. Why did the full transition to deliberate cultivation wait until after the catastrophe? One answer is the Younger Dryas itself. The catastrophic population reduction, the collapse of the megafauna, the disruption of the hunter-gatherer subsistence systems that had sustained people for thousands of years, created a situation in which the old ways were no longer viable for many communities. The recovery period offered a new landscape, more productive in certain ways than before, with reduced megafauna to hunt, with human populations low enough that the land was not yet carrying as many people as it could support. Under these conditions, the investment in cultivation made sense in ways it might not have made sense before. It was a new strategy for a new world, developed by people who knew, in their cultural memory, what the old world had been and how completely it could be taken away. The spread of agriculture from the Fertile Crescent across the rest of the world over the subsequent millennia is one of the most consequential processes in human history. It enabled population growth at rates impossible under hunter-gatherer subsistence. It enabled the accumulation of caloric surplus that freed some members of communities from food production to specialize in other things. It enabled sedentism, permanent settlements, the social complexity that comes from living in one place with the same people for your entire life. It enabled, ultimately, cities, writing, civilization in the sense we conventionally use that word. All of this was seeded in the aftermath of the Younger Dryas, by the survivors, by the people who came through the worst, and then, in the warmth that followed, made something new. But the relationship between the catastrophe and what came after is not as simple as collapse followed by recovery. The catastrophe shaped what came after in ways that go beyond just creating the conditions for agriculture. It shaped the psychology of the survivors, the culture, the stories they told about what had happened and why, the flood myths. Let us finally talk about the flood myths properly. Over 200 distinct cultures spread across every inhabited continent have flood myths in their traditional narratives, stories of a great flood that destroyed the world, killing most of the people, leaving only a small number of survivors who then rebuilt. The specifics vary enormously. The cause of the flood varies. The survivors vary. The divine or supernatural framing varies. But the core structure is remarkably consistent across cultures that have had no contact with each other. A great water came, almost everyone died, a remnant survived, and the world that exists now was built by those survivors. This consistency has fascinated and puzzled scholars for centuries. The rationalist explanation is that floods are common experiences in human life, that river floods and coastal floods and monsoon floods are universal features of human environments, and that the narrative structure of destruction followed by survival is simply a natural form for stories about any kind of catastrophic experience. The myths are not literal memories of a single event. They are narrative templates applied to many different experiences over many different times. This explanation is probably partly right, but it may not be entirely sufficient. Consider the timing. The period from approximately 14,000 to 8,000 years ago was marked by dramatic, rapid sea level rise. The coastal flooding of this period was not the ordinary river floods of human experience. It was the permanent, irreversible drowning of landscapes that had supported human populations for thousands of years. The inundation of coastal plains and river deltas and continental shelf lowlands that had been home to some of the densest human populations on Earth. These events happened within cultural memory, within the span of stories that could be transmitted across generations. And consider the geography of the myths. The most elaborate and ancient flood narratives come from exactly the regions most severely affected by the sea level rise and the Younger Dryas events. Mesopotamia, which sits on the alluvial plain of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers and has been subject to massive flooding for as long as anyone has lived there. The Indian subcontinent, whose coastlines changed dramatically as sea levels rose. Coastal Southeast Asia, enormous areas of which were drowned as the Sunda Shelf was inundated. The Pacific Islands, whose ancestors came from exactly the coastal lowland populations most affected by the sea level changes. The flood myths may be preserving something real, not a single flood, not one event that one culture witnessed and then shared with all the others, but a genuine cultural memory, transmitted in different forms through different traditions, of an actual period of catastrophic flooding that changed the world, a period when the sea came inland and did not retreat, when the lands that people's grandparents and great-grandparents had known were drowned and gone, when the world that had been was replaced by the world that is. In the Sumerian flood myth, which is one of the oldest written versions and which clearly underlies the biblical account of Noah, the survivors of the flood are tasked with preserving the seeds of all living things and the knowledge of all crafts, so that the world can be rebuilt after the water recedes. This is a striking detail, not just saving lives but explicitly saving knowledge, the cultural inheritance that makes civilization possible. The myth encodes an awareness that knowledge is fragile, that it can be lost, that the deliberate preservation of knowledge is one of the most important things a community can do. The people who first told that story, whoever they were, understood something profound about what had happened. They understood that the catastrophe had not just killed people, it had killed knowledge, and that the survival of knowledge, not just the survival of bodies, was what determined whether the world could be rebuilt. Göbekli Tepe and the flood myths are connected by this understanding. Both of them are responses to the same catastrophe. Both of them are attempts to preserve something through the disaster. The flood myths preserved the memory of what had been lost and the knowledge of how to rebuild. Göbekli Tepe preserved the memory in stone, physically, in a form that could outlast the people who built it. Both of them encoded in different ways the most important lesson the survivors had learned: the world can end. And the only defense against that is deliberate, effortful preservation of what matters most. Here is something the standard historical narrative gets wrong about this period. It frames the development of agriculture and civilization as progress, as humanity moving forward, advancing, developing. The hunter-gatherer as a more primitive stage on the way to the civilized state. This framing has been thoroughly critiqued by anthropologists over the past several decades, and the critique is correct. Hunter-gatherer life is not a lower stage of development. It is a different and in many ways highly sophisticated form of human social organization, one that sustained our species for hundreds of thousands of years. But there is another problem with the progress narrative that is specifically relevant to the Younger Dryas story. The progress narrative implies that what happened was additive, that civilization was built on top of what existed before, adding complexity and capability over time. The Younger Dryas evidence suggests something much more complicated, something much more like loss followed by a desperate rebuild than like steady forward progress. The human populations who built Göbekli Tepe, who developed agriculture, who established the first permanent settlements, were not building on the full foundation of what had come before, they were building on the fragment that survived. The 90% of cultural knowledge that died with the 90% of people was gone. What was preserved was the lucky remnant, the knowledge that happened to be held by communities in locations that were survivable, in networks that were robust enough to maintain the chain of transmission through the worst years. We do not know what we lost. That is the most haunting aspect of this story. We do not know what knowledge, what ways of understanding the world, what cultural achievements, what songs or stories or technologies or social structures or cosmologies were erased in the Younger Dryas. We can see the sites that were abandoned. We can see the tool traditions that ended. We can see the genetic lineages that stopped. But we cannot see what was in the minds of the people who died, what they knew, what they believed, what they loved. Some researchers have speculated about what might have been lost. There are tantalizing hints in the archaeological record, in the sophistication of pre-Younger Dryas cultures, in the scale and complexity of sites that existed before the catastrophe and that were not matched for thousands of years afterward, that the cultural world that was destroyed may have been more complex than we can easily reconstruct. The Magdalenian culture of Western Europe produced cave art of extraordinary quality. The proto-agricultural communities of the Fertile Crescent had been intensifying their relationship with wild plants and animals for thousands of years. The coastal populations that drowned with the rising seas left almost no physical record. We are the heirs of the survivors. Our civilizations, our knowledge, our ways of understanding the world, all descend from the fraction that made it through. The world we live in was not built from the full richness of what humanity had developed over hundreds of thousands of years. It was built from the remnant, from what was left after the world nearly ended. That is a sobering thought, not paralyzing, but sobering, because it means that the question of what we know is also, always, a question of what we have forgotten. What was lost before the record we have access to begins. What wisdom or understanding or capability existed in the 90% that we cannot reach anymore? Now let's bring this story forward, to what came after, to the world that the survivors built in the warmth after the cold. The agricultural revolution that began in the Fertile Crescent around 11,000 years ago spread across the world over the subsequent millennia, not as a single wave, but as a complex, regionally varied process of adoption, adaptation, and independent invention. Farming was invented independently in at least 7 different locations around the world: the Fertile Crescent, China, New Guinea, Mexico, the Andes, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Eastern North America. Each of these independent inventions happened after the Younger Dryas, in the more productive, more stable climate of the early Holocene. This pattern, multiple independent inventions of agriculture in multiple locations within a relatively short window of time after the Younger Dryas, is itself a kind of evidence. It suggests that the conditions of the early Holocene were specifically conducive to the development of agriculture. The combination of warming climate, increased rainfall, expanded wild grain populations, and reduced megafauna created a situation in which intensified plant management made more sense than it had before. And the reduced human population, with its reduced pressure on wild resources, may have created both the need and the opportunity to develop new subsistence strategies. The population growth that followed the adoption of agriculture was rapid. Farming can support far more people per unit of land than hunting and gathering. The densities of early agricultural villages were dramatically higher than anything hunter-gatherers achieved, and those densities created the conditions for the development of everything we think of as civilization. Language diversified rapidly. Trade networks expanded and deepened. Social hierarchies emerged from the accumulation and control of agricultural surplus. The first towns appeared, then the first cities. Writing developed, independently in Mesopotamia and China and Mesoamerica, as a tool for tracking the increasingly complex economic and administrative affairs of settled communities. The wheel, metal tools, monumental architecture, religion organized around agricultural cycles and the need to manage the relationship between human communities and the natural forces that determined whether the harvest would succeed or fail. All of this, the entire edifice of what we call civilization, emerged within a few thousand years of the Younger Dryas. In geological time, it is almost instantaneous. 12,000 years ago, the Younger Dryas is ending. 10,000 years ago, the first agricultural villages are established. 5,000 years ago, the first cities exist. Writing appears. 4,000 years ago, the first empires. 3,000 years ago, iron. 2,000 years ago, the Roman Empire. 500 years ago, the printing press. 100 years ago, electricity. 50 years ago, the internet. Viewed at this scale, human civilization is a phenomenon of the post-Younger Dryas period. Everything we think of as civilization happened in the 12,000 years since the catastrophe ended. the entire preceding 200,000 years of anatomically modern human existence produced no cities, no writing, no agriculture, no empires. And then, after the worst period in human history since the Toba eruption, everything happened at once. Or at least, that is how it looks from where we stand. This observation deserves to be held carefully. It does not mean that the people before the Younger Dryas were less intelligent or less capable. They were neither. The human brain was exactly as capable before the Younger Dryas as it is today. The conditions for the emergence of civilization, specifically the need for agricultural surplus management that writing and numeracy serve, simply did not exist in the same way before the transition to farming. And the transition to farming was triggered in part by the catastrophe, by the collapse of the megafauna that had been the primary caloric base for many populations, by the disruption of the hunter-gatherer subsistence systems that had sustained humanity for hundreds of thousands of years, by the need to find new ways to feed the remnant populations in a changed world. The catastrophe, in a very real sense, is what created the conditions for civilization. Not because catastrophe is a good thing, it is not. The loss of 90% of the human population is not progress. It is tragedy on a scale that dwarfs anything in recorded history. But the world that came out of that tragedy, the warmer, more productive early Holocene world that the survivors inherited, combined with the disruption of the old subsistence systems, created a specific set of conditions in which agriculture was possible and advantageous in ways it had not been before. We are the civilization that was built by the survivors of the world that ended, and the fact that we exist at all, that the chain of human life and knowledge was not broken entirely, is a product of the same combination of luck and resilience and social cohesion that has always determined whether human populations survive catastrophe or not. There is one more piece of this story that I want to spend some time with, because it changes how I think about the people who came before. The Younger Dryas is not the only global climate catastrophe in the period we've been discussing. There is another one that falls right in the middle of our story, and it is less well known but equally important. Around 8,200 years ago, as the warming of the early Holocene was producing the conditions for agricultural expansion, there was a sudden, severe cold snap. Scientists call it the 8.2 kiloyear event. It was not as long as the Younger Dryas. It lasted perhaps a few hundred years. But it was severe. Temperatures in the North Atlantic region dropped by several degrees. The monsoons weakened. Droughts hit the Fertile Crescent and North Africa. The trigger was another catastrophic glacial lake drainage. Lake Agassiz, or what remained of it after the earlier drainages, finally drained completely, sending another enormous pulse of fresh water into the North Atlantic and disrupting the ocean circulation again. For the early agricultural communities of the Fertile Crescent, who'd only been farming for a few thousand years, and who had not yet developed the infrastructure and social complexity to buffer severe droughts, this was devastating. The archaeological record shows widespread abandonment of early agricultural sites during this period. Communities that had been building the foundations of urban civilization suddenly contracted or disappeared. But something interesting happened afterward. When the cold snap ended and the climate recovered, the communities that had survived the 8.2 kiloyear event emerged with something they had not had before. They emerged with a more complex social organization, with more centralized institutions, with a more developed capacity for managing agricultural surplus, and coordinating large-scale collective action. The catastrophe, in other words, appears to have been a forcing function for the development of the social complexity that characterizes early civilization. This pattern, catastrophe followed by increased complexity in the surviving communities, is visible multiple times in the human record. The Younger Dryas produced the conditions for the development of agriculture. The 8.2 kiloyear event appears to have accelerated the development of urban complexity. Later catastrophes, droughts and floods and volcanic eruptions and epidemics, have repeatedly produced similar patterns of collapse, followed by reorganization at a higher level of complexity. This is not an argument that catastrophes are good. They are not. The costs in human suffering are enormous and irreversible, but it is an observation about the specific resilience of human social organization, about the way that human communities, when reduced to remnants and forced to rebuild, sometimes build back in ways that are more adaptive to the threats they have just faced than the communities they replaced. The people who built Göbekli Tepe understood this, I think, in their own way. They were building something that was meant to survive the end of the world, something that would be there for whoever came after, however much time had passed. Something that said, "We were here. We understood what had happened. We built this so you would know." They could not have imagined us. They could not have imagined the 11,000 years that separated their moment from ours. They could not have imagined the cities and the writing and the telescopes and the genome sequencing and all the rest of it. But they built something anyway, in stone, with intention, with the knowledge that the world could end and the understanding that what mattered most was what survived. Now let's think about what all of this means for us, not in a panic, not as a counsel of despair, but as the specific kind of understanding that changes how you hold your place in history. We live in a world that was built after a catastrophe. The civilization that contains you, the language you think in, the food systems that feed you, the cities that organize your life, all of it is a post-catastrophe construction. It was built by survivors who understood, in a way we have largely forgotten, what it means for the world to nearly end. The Younger Dryas was not the first catastrophe in human history, and it was not the last. The record of human civilization is a record of catastrophe survived. The Toba eruption 74,000 years ago. The Younger Dryas 12,000 years ago. The 8.2 kilo-year event 8,000 years ago. The Bronze Age collapse, the Black Death, the Little Ice Age, each one killing enormous numbers of people, disrupting the social and cultural systems that had developed, forcing the survivors to rebuild in changed conditions, and each time the survivors rebuilt. Not the same thing, not a perfect recovery, but something adapted to the new conditions, something that carried forward what could be carried forward and invented new ways to manage what could not. The accumulation of those rebuilds, over 12,000 years of post-Younger Dryas human history, is the civilization we inhabit today. We are the products of all those survivors, their biological descendants and their cultural heirs. The agricultural techniques that feed the world were developed by communities rebuilding after the Younger Dryas. The social complexity that organizes modern life was forged in part by communities surviving the catastrophes that followed. The story that says the world can end and the world can be rebuilt is the oldest story we have. It is encoded in the flood myths. It is built in stone at Göbekli Tepe. It is written in the genetic bottlenecks that show up when we look at population history. What does this mean for how we live now? I do not think it means we should be afraid. Fear is a reasonable response to threat, but it is not a productive response to historical understanding. What I think it means is something more like gratitude, and something more like responsibility. Gratitude for the improbable fact of your existence. You are here because every single one of your ancestors survived catastrophes that most of the people alive at the time did not. The Younger Dryas killed 9 out of 10 humans. One of your ancestors was the 10th, not through merit, not through deserving it, but through some combination of luck and geography and social connection, and the random chance of where they happened to be when the cold came. And from that one ancestor, through an unbroken chain of survival events, you exist. That is extraordinary. It should feel extraordinary. It should produce in you something like awe at the improbability of your own presence here, in this moment, alive and thinking and capable of learning about the catastrophes that almost erased the line that produced you, and responsibility. The survivors of the Younger Dryas built Göbekli Tepe because they understood that what mattered most had to be preserved, had to be protected in forms that could outlast the people who held it. The knowledge that makes civilization possible is fragile. It exists in people, in institutions, in texts and tools and practices that can be disrupted and lost. The people who built that potbelly hill in the hills of southeastern Turkey knew this in a way that we, insulated by the apparent stability of modern civilization, sometimes forget. We are the custodians of an enormously complex and fragile body of knowledge and social organization. It has been built up over 12,000 years by the survivors of catastrophes. It can be disrupted. The lesson of the Younger Dryas is not that civilization is doomed. The lesson is that civilization is a project, an ongoing, effortful project of preservation and transmission and adaptation, something that requires active maintenance, not passive assumption of permanence. The people who came through the Younger Dryas did not survive by assuming the world would go back to the way it was. They survived by figuring out how to live in the world that remained, and then they built the foundations of the world we live in now, not out of nostalgia for what had been lost, out of determination to build something worth preserving in what remained. The Younger Dryas ended 11,700 years ago, abruptly. The climate shifted back toward warmth with the same shocking speed with which it had shifted toward cold 1,200 years earlier. The ice cores show it happening in years, possibly in a single decade. The dust cleared, the monsoons returned, the grasslands began to recover, the rivers ran fuller. The people who were alive at the end of the Younger Dryas had never known the world before it. They had been born into the cold. They had grown up in the diminished, disrupted world the cold had made. The warmth that was arriving was not a restoration for them. It was something new. It's a different world from the one their grandparents had described. A world of possibility they had never experienced. And they took it. They planted. They built. They remembered. They told stories about what had been lost and about how it had been lost and about what it meant that they were still here to tell the stories. They built Göbekli Tepe on a hilltop in the new warmth and carved the animals of their world into stone and arranged enormous pillars in circles and gathered at the site for reasons that made complete sense to them, even if we cannot fully reconstruct those reasons 12,000 years later. They knew what we sometimes forget, that the world is not permanent, that the things we depend on can disappear, that the only defense against loss is deliberate preservation, and that the work of preservation, the work of passing knowledge and memory and meaning forward from one generation to the next, is the most important work there is. You are the beneficiary of that work. Every person who ever carried a story forward, who taught a child a skill, who built a structure meant to outlast themselves, who wrote something down, who preserved knowledge through a catastrophe, is part of the chain that produced this moment. The warmth you're lying in right now, the shelter around you, the language in which these words make sense to you, all of it is the accumulated product of 12,000 years of survivors refusing to let the chain break. The Younger Dryas took 90% of the people, but it did not take everything. It could not, because even in the worst of it, even in the coldest and darkest and most desperate years, there were people who kept going, who fed their children and told their stories and maintained the connections that made communities possible, who built in stone what could not be preserved in flesh, who refused, in the most ordinary and extraordinary sense, to let the world end completely. You are here because they did that. Now let the questions settle into something quieter. You do not need to solve this tonight. You do not need to hold all of it at once. The Younger Dryas is 12,000 years in the past. Its story is still being told, still being excavated from the soil of Göbekli Tepe and from the sediment of the North Atlantic and from the ice of Greenland and from the genomes of every living person on Earth. Let yourself rest in the warmth that the survivors built toward, in the particular warmth of the specific moment you are in. The world has ended before. The world has been rebuilt before, and the people who rebuilt it were no different from you. They had the same brains, the same capacity for love and fear and determination and community, the same need for warmth and story, the same ability to keep going when most of the evidence suggested they should stop. They kept the light. In the smallest ways, in the most ordinary acts of survival and care and transmission, they kept the light, and the light reached you. The hilltop in Turkey where Göbekli Tepe sits is quiet now. The excavations continue, slowly. There is far more buried there than has been uncovered. The people who built it intended it to last, and it has lasted, and it is still giving back what it was built to preserve. The memory of a world that ended. The evidence that the people who survived it were extraordinary. The reminder that the impulse to build something meaningful, something worth preserving, something that reaches forward through time to whoever comes next, is one of the oldest and most human things we have. Rest now. The world ended once and was rebuilt by people who had almost nothing. You have rather more than almost nothing. Whatever comes, you have the same equipment they had, the same brain, the same capacity for care and ingenuity and community and determination, the same ability to keep going. The Younger Dryas ended in a decade. The warmth came back. The survivors built Göbekli Tepe. Let's go back to the ice, because the ice holds the most precise record of what happened, and the precision matters for understanding the specific nightmare of the Younger Dryas. The Greenland ice sheet is one of the most extraordinary natural archives on the planet. It has been accumulating snow for hundreds of thousands of years. Each year's snowfall compresses under the weight of subsequent years into a distinct layer of ice. Those layers contain air bubbles, dust particles, pollen, volcanic ash and water molecules, whose chemical composition varies with the temperature at which the snow fell. By drilling down through the ice sheet and extracting a core, scientists can read the climate history of the North Atlantic region year by year, layer by layer, going back over 100,000 years. Two major ice core projects, GISP2 and GRIP, drilled deep into the Greenland ice sheet in the early 1990s. The cores they extracted changed our understanding of climate variability in ways that made headlines at the time and whose full implications are still being worked out. What the cores showed was that the climate of the last glacial period was not just cold, it was violently unstable. There were rapid oscillations between warmer and colder conditions called Dansgaard-Oeschger events, occurring on timescales of decades to centuries throughout the glacial period. The climate system was not in a stable state. It was in a metastable state, capable of flipping rapidly between different modes of operation. The Younger Dryas shows up in the cores with particular clarity. The onset, around 12,900 years ago, is visible as an abrupt change in the oxygen isotope ratios that track temperature, happening within a few decades at most and possibly within a few years. The dust levels spike, indicating dry, cold, windy conditions. The accumulation rate of snow changes. Everything changes at once in what is geologically speaking a single moment. What the cores also show is the regional variability of the impact. The Younger Dryas was most severe in the North Atlantic region. Greenland itself experienced some of the most dramatic cooling, losing perhaps 15 degrees Celsius of mean annual temperature compared to the warm period that preceded it. Western Europe was severely affected. The Middle East experienced reduced rainfall and increased drought conditions. North America was affected, though the pattern was geographically complex, with some regions experiencing more severe conditions than others, depending on their position relative to the retreating ice sheets and changing atmospheric circulation patterns. Other regions of the world were affected differently. Parts of the southern hemisphere actually warmed slightly during the Younger Dryas, as ocean heat that was no longer being transported northward through the Atlantic circulation stayed in the southern latitudes. This seesaw pattern, with the northern hemisphere cooling as the southern hemisphere warms, is a signature of Atlantic circulation disruptions and has been documented in Antarctic ice cores as well as in marine sediment records from the Southern Ocean. For human populations, this geographic variability meant that the catastrophe, while global in its reach, was not uniform in its severity. Populations in the severely affected northern regions faced the most extreme conditions. Populations in less affected regions had a harder time, but not an impossible time, and populations in regions that were actually somewhat improved by the changed atmospheric patterns, certain parts of the southern hemisphere, parts of East Africa, had survivable conditions even during the worst years. This geographic variability is part of why the human species survived at all. If the Younger Dryas had been equally catastrophic everywhere on Earth simultaneously, the population reduction might have been complete rather than merely catastrophic. The patchiness of the impact meant that there were always refugia, places where conditions were bad but not unsurvivable, where populations could maintain themselves in reduced numbers until the climate improved. But here is what is important about those refugia populations. They were small, they were isolated, they were under enormous demographic pressure, and the genetic evidence from their descendants, from us, shows that the bottleneck was real and severe. The reduced genetic diversity of modern human populations compared to what you would expect from a species our age is a direct measure of how severe the reduction was. We are all, every one of the 8 billion people alive today, descended from the small populations that survived the Younger Dryas and subsequent catastrophes. The rest of the human genetic diversity that existed before, the full spectrum of human biological variation that had developed over hundreds of thousands of years in populations around the world, is gone. This is not just a population genetic statistic. It is a statement about who we are. Our entire species, all of our variation, all of our diversity, represents only a fraction of what human diversity once was. The populations that died in the Younger Dryas carried genetic variations we will never recover. Physical traits, cognitive tendencies, immune responses, biological capabilities that existed in the full diversity of pre-Younger Dryas humanity. Gone with the people who carried them. We are a bottlenecked species. Beautiful and complex and capable as we are, we are the remnant of something that was once far more varied. And the world we built, rich and complex as it is, was built by that remnant with the knowledge that remnant managed to preserve. There is a specific site in what is now Jordan that illuminates something important about the people who came through the Younger Dryas. It is called Ain Ghazal, and it dates to the early Neolithic period, the period immediately following the Younger Dryas, during which agriculture was becoming established in the region. At Ain Ghazal, archaeologists discovered a cache of remarkable objects buried deliberately under the floors of houses. 2-headed figurines, plaster statues, ritual objects of a kind not found in later sites. But what is most extraordinary about Ain Ghazal is not the objects. It is the evidence of what the community did when the climate deteriorated again during the 8.2 kiloyear event. The site shows clear evidence of stress and population decline during this period. And then, as the climate recovered, it shows evidence of a community that had made a decision. Rather than staying and trying to recover in place, they deliberately buried their most important ritual objects, the statues and figurines that were presumably the focus of their religious and communal life. They buried them carefully, deliberately, as if they expected someone to return and find them. Then they left. The burial of ritual objects before departure or in the face of catastrophe is a pattern that appears in multiple cultures across multiple periods. It is not random. It reflects a specific understanding, the understanding that the objects carry meaning that must be preserved, that the meaning is not safe if the objects are exposed to whatever comes next, that the act of burial is itself an act of cultural transmission. Hiding something valuable for the future is an act of hope. It assumes there will be a future. It assumes someone will be there to find what you left. The people who buried the Ain Ghazal statues did not know if they would return. They did not know if anyone would return. But they buried their most important things anyway, in the hope that something would survive and that something would matter to whoever survived it. This is not primitive behavior. This is not the instinct of people who do not know any better. This is the deliberate, reasoned action of people who understood their situation clearly enough to know what needed to be done. They had cultural objects of great importance. Those objects needed to survive. The best way to ensure their survival was to put them in the ground. So they did. The same logic that drove the builders of Göbekli Tepe to eventually bury their temple, the same logic that drove the compilers of the Sumerian flood myth to encode in their story the imperative to preserve the seeds of all living things, the same logic that drives every act of archiving, every library built, every text copied, every tradition deliberately maintained and transmitted. The understanding that knowledge and meaning are fragile, that they can be lost, that losing them is one of the worst things that can happen to a community, and that the work of preservation, unglamorous and often invisible, is therefore among the most important work that human beings do. Let us talk about the specific humans who survived the Younger Dryas in the region that matters most for the subsequent history of civilization. The Fertile Crescent, the arc of land running from the eastern Mediterranean coast through modern-day Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and into Iran, where the wild ancestors of wheat and barley grow, and where the rivers Tigris and Euphrates created productive agricultural conditions. The Natufian culture occupied this region during the millennia, immediately preceding and partially overlapping with the Younger Dryas. They were semi-sedentary, meaning they were beginning to settle in one place for longer periods, rather than moving constantly with the seasons, though they had not yet made the full transition to agricultural village life. They harvested wild grains intensively, using flint-bladed sickles to cut the ripe grain heads. They ground the grain on stone mortars. They stored it in plastered pits. They built relatively permanent structures of stone and wood. The Natufian communities were doing something that looks like a halfway step between hunting and gathering and agriculture. They had not domesticated the plants they harvested. The wheat and barley they ate were still wild varieties, but they were managing their relationship with those plants in ways that went beyond simple opportunistic harvesting. They were harvesting in ways that, over time, would have exerted selection pressure on the plants toward traits that made them easier to harvest, such as non-shattering grain heads that stay on the plant until the human harvester removes them, rather than dropping naturally to the ground. Then the Younger Dryas hit the Fertile Crescent. The consequences for the Natufian communities were severe. The cold, dry conditions of the Younger Dryas reduced the productivity of the wild grain stands they depended on. The gazelle herds that were the other major component of their diet became less abundant as their habitat changed. The semi-sedentary lifestyle became harder to maintain as the resources that had allowed it became less reliable. The Natufian archaeological record shows a response to this pressure that is illuminating. Some communities did what they had not needed to do before. They moved. The semi-sedentism that had been developing as wild resource productivity allowed it was reversed. Communities that had been building more permanent structures moved back toward more mobile strategies, following resources rather than waiting for resources to come to them. The investment in fixed infrastructure, the stone-built structures, the storage facilities was abandoned. Mobility was the survival strategy. But other communities did something different. In some locations, particularly in the more sheltered microenvironments where the impact of the Younger Dryas was somewhat moderated, Natufian communities stayed. And in staying, in committing to a specific location and its resources even when those resources were stressed, they intensified their management of those resources in ways that crossed the line from intensive harvesting into active cultivation. The transition was not dramatic. It was not a moment of invention. It was a gradual shift in practice, driven by the necessity of managing increasingly stressed resources in ways that maintained productivity, planting some of the seeds you had harvested rather than eating all of them, removing competing plants from around the grain stands, watering during dry spells. The practices of agriculture were not invented all at once. They accumulated one small adaptation at a time under the pressure of the Younger Dryas. By the time the Younger Dryas ended and the climate began to improve, The communities that had stayed, that had intensified their resource management under pressure, had already crossed the threshold. They had domesticated plants. The wheat and barley they were harvesting had been changed over the generations of cultivation into varieties more suited to human harvest and storage. The communities themselves had been changed, adapted to a more sedentary lifestyle that revolving around the cultivation and storage of grain rather than the mobile pursuit of wild resources. When the climate improved and the early Holocene warmth made agricultural productivity possible at scales not achievable during the Younger Dryas, these communities were already positioned to take advantage. They had the knowledge, they had the partially domesticated crops, they had the social structures built around sedentary life and agricultural management. They were ready. The catastrophe had forced the adaptation. The survivors of the Younger Dryas in the Fertile Crescent had, through the necessity of managing stressed resources in a diminished world, developed the practices that would feed the civilizations to come. This is not a comfortable narrative exactly. The development of agriculture is often presented as a triumph, and in terms of its ultimate consequences for human population growth and cultural complexity, it was. But the immediate experience of early agricultural communities was often harder than the hunter-gatherer life it replaced, in ways that the bones of early farmers make visible. Early agricultural populations show higher rates of dental decay from the starchy diet, more evidence of nutritional deficiency, more evidence of epidemic disease from the crowded living conditions, shorter average stature than their hunter-gatherer predecessors, reflecting poorer overall nutrition despite the increased caloric availability. Agriculture was not chosen because it was better. It was chosen because the alternative, in the conditions created by the Younger Dryas, was to die. And from that choice, made under duress by communities in a diminished world, everything else followed. There is a question that the Younger Dryas story raises that I want to sit with for a moment, not to answer it, because it does not have a comfortable answer, but to hold it. The question is, what did we lose? Not just in terms of population. We have talked about the population loss, not just in terms of the cultural knowledge that died with the people who carried it. We have talked about that too, but something more specific, more targeted. Human populations before the Younger Dryas had been living with and managing the megafauna of their respective continents for tens of thousands of years. The mammoth hunters of Eurasia and North America had an intimate knowledge of mammoth ecology and behaviour built up over generations. That knowledge was practical, yes. It was how you hunted, where the herds went in different seasons, what drove them, how they communicated, how they responded to different kinds of pressure. But it was also something more. The relationship between the human populations and the megafauna they lived alongside and hunted was not a purely predatory relationship. The cave painting suggests something more complex, something that looks, from a distance of 20,000 years, like awe, like reverence, like the acknowledgement of kinship with something large and powerful and ancient. The mammoths and the giant sloths and the cave lions were not just resources. They were part of the world, part of the ecology that human knowledge had developed within and around and in relationship to. When the megafauna went extinct, that relationship ended. The specific ecological knowledge built around those animals became obsolete in the most total possible way, and something more than practical knowledge was lost with it. A way of being in the world, a way of understanding the human place in relation to the other large creatures that shared the landscape. an entire imaginative and spiritual vocabulary built around animals that no longer existed. The cave paintings of the Paleolithic are the most vivid evidence of that vocabulary. The extraordinary skill and care with which those animals were depicted, the sense of living presence they convey, even after 20,000 years. These are not the works of people who thought of animals as mere resources. These are the works of people for whom animals were central to the meaning of existence. That tradition ended with the megafauna, the specific form of human relationship with the large animals of the world that the cave paintings represent, the intimate, reverential knowledge of creatures that were both prey and kin, was disrupted and largely lost. What replaced it in the agricultural world that came after was a different relationship. The domesticated animal, the livestock, the creature defined by its utility to human purposes rather than by its own existence in the wild world. The relationship changed from one of encounter, in which the human was a participant in an ecosystem that did not belong to them, to one of ownership, in which the animal was a possession defined by human need. I am not saying the agricultural relationship with animals is wrong. I am saying that something was lost in the transition. A way of being in the world that the cave paintings capture and that we cannot fully recover because the creatures that formed its centre are gone. The Younger Dryas did not cause the megafauna extinction entirely. Human hunting pressure had been building for millennia before, but the Younger Dryas delivered the final blow to populations already stressed by that pressure, and the extinction of the megafauna was one of the most profound and irreversible consequences of the catastrophe. We live in a world without mammoths, without giant ground sloths, without horses in the Americas before the Spanish brought them back, without the guild of large herbivores that shaped the Pleistocene ecosystems of every continent. The world we inhabit is an ecologically impoverished version of the world that existed before the catastrophe, and the impoverishment is permanent. Those species are gone. They will not return unless we find ways to bring them back through genetic technology, which some researchers are working on, but which is a different kind of existence than the wild populations that evolved over millions of years. The Younger Dryas hollowed out the world, not just the human world, the ecological world, the world of large animals and the ecosystems they shaped, and the human cultures that developed in relationship with them. What we inherited from the survivors is not the full richness of what existed before. It is a fragment, a remnant. And in that fragment we have built everything we have, which is extraordinary, but we have built it without the rest of what was there. Let me end with something that grounds all of this in the present, something that brings it back from the deep past into the world you are lying in right now. The Younger Dryas is over. It ended 11,700 years ago. The climate we live in, the Holocene, is the warm interglacial period that followed it, and it has been remarkably stable by the standards of the geological record. The stability of the Holocene is, in fact, one of the preconditions for the development of agriculture and civilization. The year-to-year and decade-to-decade variability of the climate during the last 12,000 years has been low enough that it was possible to develop agriculture, to accumulate surplus, to build permanent settlements, to plan for the future in ways that the volatile climate of the Pleistocene did not permit. This stability is not guaranteed. The climate record shows us that the Holocene stability, while real, is neither infinite nor unconditional. The Younger Dryas itself interrupted a warming period that in some ways resembled the present. The 8.2 kiloyear event showed that severe climate disruption was possible even within the generally stable Holocene. The climate change we are experiencing now is different from the Younger Dryas in its mechanism, in its driver, in its direction. But it is a reminder that the climatic conditions that made civilization possible are not permanent features of the Earth system. They are a particular configuration of ocean circulation and atmospheric chemistry, and ice sheet behavior, and solar input that has existed for 12,000 years, and that can change. I am not saying this to produce fear. Fear is not useful information. I am saying it because the Younger Dryas is a reminder of what human communities are capable of when the conditions they adapted to change faster than they can comfortably adapt, and it is a reminder of what human communities are capable of in the aftermath. The survivors of the worst built something extraordinary in the warmth that followed, not because they had forgotten what was lost, but because they had not. The lesson of the Younger Dryas is not that catastrophe is inevitable or that civilization is doomed. The lesson is simpler and more personal than that. The world is not permanent. The things we depend on are not guaranteed. And the work of maintaining and preserving and transmitting what matters, the work of the person who tells the story, the builder who builds in stone, the farmer who saves the seed, the teacher who passes on what they know, is the most important work there is. 12,000 years after the world nearly ended, the work continues. In every classroom and every library and every conversation between an elder and a child, and every act of deliberate remembering. The chain of transmission that connects you to the survivors of the Younger Dryas has never been broken. It runs through every generation between them and you, through the catastrophes and the recoveries and the building and the loss and the building again. You are at the current end of that chain, not the final end, the current end, the place where everything that was preserved and transmitted has arrived in you, in this moment, capable of learning and thinking and passing forward whatever you understand about the world. The warmth after the Younger Dryas was not taken for granted by the people who first experienced it. They knew what cold felt like. They knew what the end of the world felt like, because they or their parents had lived it. The warmth was extraordinary to them. The productive landscape was extraordinary. The possibility of building something lasting was extraordinary. You are in the warmth. The long warmth of 12,000 years as post-catastrophe civilization, built by survivors, maintained by the ceaseless work of transmission and preservation, arriving in you. Let it settle into you gently tonight. The weight of how much was almost lost, and the warmth of how much survived, and how long the chain had to hold to get from there to here. It held. You are here. Here is something specific and measurable that the Younger Dryas left behind in the genetics of every living human being. When population geneticists study the diversity of mitochondrial DNA across modern human populations, they find something unexpected. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited exclusively through the maternal line. It does not recombine. It accumulates mutations slowly and predictably. And the pattern of mitochondrial diversity in modern humans is far lower than you would expect from a species our age and our geographic range. Modern humans have been anatomically present for at least 200,000 years. In 200,000 years, across populations spread across an entire planet, you would expect to see a great deal of genetic diversity. Not infinite, but substantial. What you actually see is consistent with an effective population size, meaning the number of individuals actually contributing genes to the next generation, That has been very small for much of our history. Estimates based on genetic diversity put the effective population of ancestral humans at various bottleneck points at numbers as low as 10,000 individuals. Some analyses suggest even lower. The Younger Dryas bottleneck is one of the events contributing to this reduced diversity. The genetic signature of small populations that went through severe reductions in size is preserved in the genomes of their descendants, in the limited variety of immune system gene variants, in the reduced diversity of mitochondrial haplogroups, the distinct lineages of maternal inheritance that map the movements and survivals of past human populations, in the specific patterns of genetic similarity between modern populations that reflect the shared ancestry of survivors from a period when there were very few of them left. What this means in concrete terms is that every living human being shares relatively recent common ancestors through multiple genetic lines. Not just the common ancestors we all share from the deep past. Recent common ancestors from periods of bottleneck when the populations were small enough that everyone alive today descends from a limited number of individuals. Some of those bottleneck ancestors lived through the Younger Dryas. Some of them lived through the Toba eruption before it. Some of them lived through regional catastrophes that left genetic signatures in specific populations rather than globally. But all of them had one thing in common. They survived when most others did not. And their survival, through whatever combination of luck and location and social connection and individual resilience determined who made it through, is the reason everyone alive today is here. Think about what it means to be descended from survivors. Not survivors of something trivial, survivors of events that killed 90% of their contemporaries. Your ancestral lines have run through the needle of catastrophe after catastrophe, each time being the line that made it through when most lines ended. The probability of any individual line surviving all of those bottlenecks, when looked at in advance, is extraordinarily small. And yet here you are, the product of exactly the lines that survived. This is not cause for pride. It is not a moral achievement of your ancestors. Survival in catastrophe is mostly luck, as we have discussed. It is cause for something more like wonder, at the improbability of the specific chain of events that had to unfold to produce this specific moment, this specific person, this specific consciousness aware of its own existence. Let's talk about the specific geography of survival, because it was not random. The places where human populations survived the Younger Dryas most successfully were places with specific characteristics that buffered the worst of the climate impacts. The most important characteristic was geographic diversity. Locations where many different ecological zones were accessible within a relatively small area. Mountain ranges where you could move up and down in altitude to track the shifting vegetation zones as the climate changed. Coastlines where the ocean moderated temperature extremes and provided alternative food sources when terrestrial resources failed. River valleys that remained productive even when surrounding areas dried out. The diversity of the resource base mattered enormously when individual resources were failing. The second important characteristic was connectivity. Populations that were part of broad social networks, that had trading relationships and marriage alliances with communities across a wide geographic range, had access to resources and information that isolated populations lacked. When your local territory failed, your network could provide access to territories that were doing better. When your local knowledge became obsolete because the ecosystem had changed, your network could provide access to knowledge from communities that had already adapted to the new conditions. The third characteristic was what we might call cultural resilience, the capacity to modify practices and beliefs and social structures in response to changed conditions rather than rigidly maintaining traditions that no longer worked. Cultures with more flexible subsistence strategies, broader dietary repertoires, and social structures that could accommodate rapid change survived better than cultures with highly specialized, inflexible strategies. These characteristics, ecological diversity, social connectivity, and cultural flexibility, are not random. They are related to each other. Populations in ecologically diverse environments tend to develop more diverse subsistence strategies. Populations with broad social networks tend to have more cultural exchange and therefore more cultural flexibility. The communities that survived the Younger Dryas best were likely the communities that had already developed these characteristics before the catastrophe hit. And here is what is important about the communities that survived best. Their characteristics, ecological awareness, social cooperation, cultural adaptability, were the characteristics that also, in the warmer world that followed, led to the development of agriculture and then to more complex forms of social organization. The same traits that made you a good survivor of the Younger Dryas made you a good builder of the Holocene. The communities that died were not necessarily weaker or less intelligent. Many of them were highly adapted to their specific pre-Younger Dryas environments. But that high degree of specialization was precisely what made them vulnerable when those environments changed rapidly. The most sophisticated mammoth hunters of the Eurasian steppe were superb at what they did. When the mammoths disappeared, that sophistication became irrelevant. Evolution, of cultures as well as organisms, does not reward sophistication in isolation. It rewards adaptability, the ability to do something different when what you've been doing stops working. And adaptability, in the context of catastrophic environmental change, requires exactly the diversity and connectivity and flexibility that the surviving communities had developed. There is one more dimension of the Younger Dryas story that deserves attention: the spiritual dimension. Not in the sense of making claims about what is or is not religiously true, but in the sense of understanding what the catastrophe did to the way human communities understood their place in the world and their relationship to whatever lay beyond the human sphere. The archaeological evidence from the period following the Younger Dryas shows a dramatic increase in ritual activity. Not just Göbekli Tepe, though that is the most spectacular example. Across the Fertile Crescent and into Anatolia, the early Holocene archaeological record is full of evidence of intensified ritual practice, elaborate burials, ritual objects, structured deposits that suggest deliberate, formalized relationships between the human community and the forces it depended on. The emergence of what will eventually become the organized religions of the ancient world appears to begin here, in the period immediately following the Younger Dryas. Why? What about surviving a near-extinction event produces an increase in structured ritual and religious activity? I think the answer is related to the problem of meaning. Human beings do not just need to survive. They need their survival to mean something. They need to understand why they survived when others did not. They need frameworks for understanding their place in a world that has demonstrated definitively and terrifyingly that it can take away everything they have. The catastrophe of the Younger Dryas broke the framework of meaning that hunter-gatherer communities had been operating within. The world they had understood, the stable relationships between human communities and the animals and plants and landscapes they depended on, the predictable cycles of seasons and migrations and resources, all of this had been disrupted. The framework that made the world legible was no longer adequate. The survivors needed new frameworks, new ways of understanding why the world worked the way it did, and what the obligations of human beings were in relation to whatever forces governed it. The intensification of ritual activity in the post-Younger Dryas period reflects communities working out those new frameworks, establishing new relationships with the forces they depended on, making new commitments about how to live in a world that had shown it could end. The first agricultural communities developed elaborate ritual practices around the cycle of planting and harvest. This is not surprising. Agriculture puts you in a specific, high-stakes relationship with the natural processes that determine whether the grain grows. The rain must come at the right time. The frost must not come too early. The pests must not consume too much of what you planted. These were not abstract worries. They were matters of survival, and the ritual practices that developed around them were attempts to maintain a relationship with the forces that governed them, to do what human communities had always done in the face of forces beyond their control, to make offering, to make obligation, to negotiate. Göbekli Tepe, with its elaborate animal carvings and its monumental architecture, represents an early and extraordinarily elaborate version of this impulse. The animals depicted on its pillars are not domestic animals. They are the wild animals of the steppe and the sky, vultures and foxes and cranes and aurochs, the animals of the world before domestication, the world that was disappearing as the Holocene warmed and the transition to agriculture began, and the site was built at the exact moment of that transition, as if the people building it were trying to hold on to something, to maintain a relationship with the wild world they had come from, even as they were beginning to step away from it. There is something deeply moving about that. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were in transition. They were between the world of their hunter-gatherer ancestors, the mobile, ecologically intimate world that the Younger Dryas had destroyed, and the agricultural world that was beginning to emerge in the warmth of the early Holocene. They built their monument at exactly that threshold, looking back at what was ending, looking forward at what was beginning, carving in stone the animals of the world they were leaving behind, preserving them in a medium that would last longer than anything they could carry forward. It is impossible not to feel the human resonance of that, standing at the threshold between one world and another, knowing that something is being lost and that what comes next will be different in ways you cannot fully predict, wanting to preserve something of what was, to say, this existed, these animals existed, we existed in relationship with them, remember. And now let us arrive at the end of the journey, not with answers. This story does not have clean answers, but with something to carry with you. 9600 BC is not a fixed date of catastrophe. It is the transition point, the moment when the Younger Dryas was ending and the world was beginning to warm again, the moment when the survivors, who had come through 1200 years of cold and loss and population reduction, and the extinction of the megafauna and the drowning of the coastlines, were beginning to emerge into a different and in many ways more productive world. What they had behind them was loss on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. 90% of the people who'd been alive when the cold began were gone. The cultural world that had existed, the elaborate hunter-gatherer cultures of the late Pleistocene, The Magdalenian cave painters, the Natufian proto-farmers, the maritime coastal communities of every continent had been drastically reduced and in many places eliminated. The megafauna that had been the centre of many cultures' relationship with the wild world were extinct or nearly so. The accumulated ecological knowledge of thousands of years had been partly and in some regions entirely lost. What they had in front of them was a warming world, a world becoming more productive, a world in which the wild grains were beginning to recover from the stress of the Younger Dryas, growing in dense stands on the hillsides of the Fertile Crescent, a world in which the surviving animal populations were beginning to recover their numbers in the improved conditions, a world with lower human population than it had had for millennia, which meant that the competition for resources was reduced and that there was room to try new things, new strategies, new relationships with the plants and animals they depended on. And what they had within them was everything that had gotten their ancestors through the worst of it. The social organisation that had allowed communities to pool risk and share resources across hard years. The cultural flexibility that had allowed them to change their subsistence strategies when the old ones failed. The ecological knowledge, reduced but not destroyed, that told them what the world required of them and how to provide it. The capacity for ritual and meaning-making that gave structure and purpose to the work of survival. And the memory, the transmitted understanding that the world had nearly ended and that the work of maintaining what mattered was never finished and never optional. From those survivors and those capacities, everything followed: the agriculture, the villages, the towns, the cities, the writing, the mathematics, the philosophy, the science. The technology that has, step by accumulating step, brought us from those first planted grain fields in the early Holocene to this specific moment, this specific night, this specific conversation between the deep past and the present. You are at the end of a very long chain. The chain runs from the survivors of the Younger Dryas through every generation between them and you, through the farmers who fed the first cities, through the scribes who wrote the first texts, through everyone who taught and learned and built and preserved, through all the smaller catastrophes that punctuate the 12,000 years between that moment and this one. The chain has held. It has held through everything it is holding now. Whatever worries the darkness of this particular night holds for you, whatever the specific weight is of this particular day, it is being held by a structure that has survived things far more severe. The chain of human resilience and care and cultural transmission that runs from the survivors of the world's near ending to you has never broken. It has frayed, it has come close, but it has held. You are the current end of the longest surviving story there is. The story of how human beings make it through the things that should have ended them. It has not ended. You're here. The chain is intact. Let that be enough for tonight. Let the weight of 12,000 years of survival settle gently around you, not as a burden, but as a kind of companionship. You're not alone in this. You have never been alone in this. Every ancestor who carried the chain forward is in some sense still here, in the language you think in and the food on your table and the knowledge in your head and the care you have for the people around you. The world did not end in 9,600 BC. It almost did. And from the almost, everything we have was built. That is the story. Let it rest with you as you rest. The morning will come. It always has. Sleep well.